Well, I guess I should make an introduction after having made the video. Though I've made almost this exact video so many times, what is there to say in an introduction? There's nothing Pakman says that I haven't heard before. Most things at least 100 times. That's not hyperbole. Literally 100 times. Even the Taleb stuff at this point has been long refuted. The refuted doesn't really describe what's happening here. It's more like pointing to a child that his hand is on the stove and that is why his hand is hot. I guess a running theme in this video is that Pakman, or more likely Pakman's handler, as I'm pretty sure he has a handler on this race and IQ stuff. The running theme is that these people are so stratospherically stupid on this stuff that it's breathtaking and you may find it hard to believe. So I guess I'll just warn you, he really is this dumb. But enough jibber jabber on this. Let's just get into the vid.
There is no statistically significant correlation between IQ and wealth beyond seriously cognitively limited people. You can definitely come up with some kind of sort of circular reasoning to say people with high IQ have more bureaucratic success. They hold higher positions on paper at different institutions. They do well in these hierarchically based jobs that are similar to IQ tests, which wouldn't be a big surprise, but there's no correlation with wealth. When someone with a high IQ has a job with tasks that are like an IQ test, they're going to do well. But that doesn't correlate IQ with success as defined by wealth, just with success that is similar to the IQ tests themselves. Check out this chart plotting net worth versus IQ. At the bottom, you'll see that for IQs ranging from 70 to 90, there is definitely a clustering of low net worth. Once you get past the IQ range, 70 to 90, it is a very statistically noisy distribution. Or instead of wealth, you can also look at IQ versus income. Definitely a slight correlation, but income is not rising nearly as fast as IQ, especially once you get past that 70 to 90 IQ range, where it almost levels out totally. From a scientific perspective, what we have here is a correlation that works in the left tail, but not the right tail, which suggests that IQ is mostly useful for identifying people who are seriously limited.
So this is really special. He shows this scatter plot supposedly showing no relation between IQ and income at the upper levels. Now, my good friend Sean Last, whose channel I will link in the description and who you should subscribe to, he actually recognized this graph from sight, and he recognized the paper that it was from, and so we can see what the paper actually says. The paper is, "Do you have to be smart to be rich? The impact of IQ on wealth, income, and financial distress." And in here is table 2. And wow, looks like both the net worth and income go up at all IQ levels and keeps going up past 100. And this is a truly breathtaking level of stupidity or dishonesty. It's literally on the very next page within the same paper. And since Pakman didn't actually source this scatter plot in the video, there was no way for anyone else to go check this source unless they just so happened to know what paper this graph was in. Thank you, Sean. It was literally just because Sean recognized this graph from memory that he found the original paper. So I think Pakman knew what he was doing here, since he gave the source on other studies in his video, but not this one. So I think this is not merely stupidity, but deliberate dishonesty, either on Pakman's part or on the part of Pakman's handler. And I think Pakman has a handler. I don't think he's smart enough to actually make a video like this. And it would be interesting to have his handler come forward, and so I could respond to, the handler instead of the front man. Now, there's lots of other studies that show that higher IQ predicts income in the right tail of the distribution. So even if Pakman were to get away with this one, we'd still have a bunch of studies rebutting that, and we could easily just say case outweighs anyway. It's a very stupid way for Pakman to lie, because there's so many other studies refuting this, but the coup de grace is,
if we look at just the correlation between IQ and performance in general, it looks like this. This doesn't make any sense unless, as I mentioned, IQ is merely a tool to identify people who are significantly limited in their intelligence and cognitive abilities. These correlations are low enough that there is massive overlap between supposedly low IQ and high IQ jobs.
So the first one was special. This is just precious. First of all, this isn't real data. This is something that Nassim Taleb did as a sort of graphical illustration of a theory that he had regarding the predictive validity of IQ. Taleb thinks, or thought, that IQ doesn't predict anything really past 100. That IQ is a remedial measure, and this is the point that Pakman is parroting. And he made this graph just as an illustration of this belief. This is not real data. This is not from a study. This is not from anything measured. This is not from a sample. This is not real data. This is a theoretical illustration of a position, okay? Now, since he's citing Taleb, and anyone can just go look up what Taleb said in that article, I would chalk this one up to stupidity, because this is easy to find and easy to call him out on. So I don't think it's dishonest. I think if Pakman was smart and dishonest, or his handler was smart and dishonest, they wouldn't show this, because it can be so easily found out. I think this is just stupidity. I think they're just this dumb. But yeah, Pakman thinks this is real data. It's not. But it's actually dumber than this. Because I don't want to give him too much credit, because I think even here I'm giving Pakman too much credit, because it's actually dumber than this. Because what does a correlation at a given IQ point even mean? Because what an R-squared correlation is saying is that at a certain proportion of the variance in, say, income can be explained by the variance in IQ. But at any given point, IQ is the same. So variation in IQ is not going to explain any of the variance in income at a given IQ score, because at a given IQ score, there is no variance in IQ. Okay, so this graph that Taleb made here is actually nonsense. Now, if you don't believe my take on this, if you think, don't worry, there are plenty of people with PhDs and all the funny hats and all the credentials saying exactly what I'm saying, so you can believe it. So all you people who only believe things that are said by the funny hats, well, there are plenty of funny hats who said this as well. Right? So you don't just have to take it from me. If my explanation's not good enough for you, if you have to outsource your thinking to a funny hat, then there's plenty of PhDs who say this. So this graph is nonsense, and the term not even wrong is unfortunately overused, but this is an instance of Taleb saying something that isn't just false. Would he strive to reach the diamond heights of merely being wrong, it doesn't get to wrong. It's not even truth apt, it's nonsense. And this is somewhat difficult to convey. I think, I said this before, I think it would be easier if guys like Taleb made more sophisticated errors, because these guys have PhDs, they have titles, they have prestige, and so I think for a lot of people, it's difficult for them to believe that Taleb is in fact this stupid given his credentials and titles and public prominence. But there it is, and it's just in your face, and if you understand how a correlation works in like a stats 101 degree, you know this is nonsense. And it's just, what else can you say?
On the other hand, job performance in medium complexity jobs correlates with IQ at about 0.5. Creativity correlates with IQ below 0.4. And leader effectiveness correlates with IQ at roughly 0.3. So you can still look at that and say, well, listen, 0.6 correlations are pretty high, and you're right. But once you account for a bell curve distribution, you have to realize why this is of very limited usefulness to us. Check out this chart, which shows a whole bunch of different jobs and the IQ ranges of the people who do them. A quick glance at this looks very overwhelming. Wow, the IQ range of janitors and machine operators and truck drivers is just so much lower than the IQ for doctors and professors and electrical engineers. But remember, these are ranges, and if you look very closely at this, you'll notice that the top 25% of janitors have a higher IQ than the bottom 25% of college professors. And of course, part of this is circular, because medical school requires that you've done well on things like SATs, which correlates with IQ because they're testing very similar things.
Now, what's funny about this is that Pakman himself actually refuted this in his own chart. Pakman himself points out how variation in IQ results in variation in job performance in specific jobs. So no, even within those jobs, IQ tests are predicting performance. Better doctors have higher IQs. And there's lots of other studies showing this in addition to the study Pakman brought up. Now, here's another weird thing Pakman did. So you see this chart, and this is an adaptation, and I'm glad he labels that. I guess he or someone else made that, but here's the original chart, which I'll link in the description through Sci-Hub. I don't understand why he would do this and not just show the original chart. Moreover, the original chart had a little bit more detail on the scale, and creativity's correlation with IQ on this is 0.36, which is closer to 0.4 than the 0.3 that he said. It's a small thing, and I'm a bit skeptical as to the precision of measures of creativity anyway. I think that's kind of I'm not a fan of measures of creativity. But what Pakman is doing here is just fishy. Why would he remake the chart in a clearly inferior way? I don't know. And I debated about bringing this up, but the reason IQ is a general predictor is because it's a good measure of the general intelligence factor. It's important to point out that we don't actually care about IQ itself. Nobody cares about the IQ test itself. What we care about IQ is that it is a good proxy for this thing called G, the general intelligence factor, and this is why we can use things like SAT scores and various international tests as a proxy for G. And it's really the G factor predicting all these things. Yes, to a degree, brain functions are somewhat specific, but they're also general. They're both. You know, you give someone a math test and you're testing this thing called math, but you're also kind of just testing the brain. Or you give them, you know, a progressive matrices test. Sure, you're testing pattern completion, but you're also just kind of testing the brain's ability to do stuff. That is, there are a few kinds of tests that are really good at predicting your ability to do other tasks. And pattern completion, for example, is a pretty good predictor of your ability to do anything else with the brain. It is a good general test. Now, IQ tests have anywhere from 12 to 24 to 30 subtests that are a battery of tests that are weighted, and these are designed and they have predictive validity in terms of predicting the brain's ability to do stuff in everything in the world through a process of trial and error, you know, with some theory, but at the end of the day, what matters is what happens when the rubber meets the road. Through trial and error over 100 years, right? These have been refined in such a way that they predict income, you know, about like half of the variance in income, for example. So that's just a little bit of a tangent and also an explanation of how these things actually work at a very superficial level. We're talking about G because the general intelligence factor is what predicts everything. And, you know, you can say, well, this is just a statistical construct. That's a debate there, whether you think there's a true neurological generalization. There's brain scan studies giving mixed results. But what we're talking about is at an operational level, at a phenomenological level. Not the degree to which cognitive functions are physiologically generalized. That's a whole different question. And on that, the results are mixed. But phenomenological G is proven beyond any shadow of a doubt, and opposition to phenomenological G is motivated by wanting to advance racist rape and revenge narratives.
Race is a socially constructed trait, not a distinct biological concept. But this is the position of the NIH, the APA, the American Anthropological Association. There is no gene or set of genes that all people from one race have. There's so much genetic diversity within what we refer to as races that any conversation about weighing a biological variable like genetic IQ against race is moot from the beginning.
Okay, so now Pakman is pulling rank, but he's doing it in a really dumb way. He's citing these clubs instead of just polls of researchers. If you want to know what the experts think about something, why not just do a poll? Just ask them. Now, I have an article that looks at several polls of intelligence researchers and anthropologists, and there's radical variation in views on this matter depending on where you look and who you count. Biologists tend to recognize race more than anthropologists, and people in Eastern Europe and in China recognize race more than people from NATO countries. In fact, in China, what it is we call race realism is just it's just science. It doesn't even have a name. It's not debated. It's just race is recognized virtually 100% of the time in China. In Eastern Europe, it's somewhere around 70%, and in the NATO countries, it's about 30%. That's sort of a rule of thumb. You know, weird countries, United States and Western Europe, about 30%. Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, about 70% recognized race. China, virtually 100%. That's just a general rule of thumb. As for the organizations that Pakman named and cares about so much, I don't know which anthropologists make up these orgs, who in the org was responsible for even writing the statements he's referring to that deny race. I get it, they have some authoritative sounding name and that stuff bamboozles smooth brains like Pakman, but it's just guys making a club saying things. Good for them, they say words. If there's a particularly compelling argument that they have that you would like to share, by all means. But the student body council having a vote and making up proclamations, well, that's not okay, good for them. If you want to know what you think the experts, the so-called experts, if you want to know what they think, just use polls, you dingus. And when you use polls, you'll find that there's no consensus anywhere except in China. And younger anthropologists and biologists aren't any more likely to deny race than the older ones. But these sorts of heuristics are what you use when you don't understand a topic, like Pakman. Since I actually understand this topic, I spend time talking about studies, not what various student body councils say about something. Because I've read more on this topic than most of these credentialed experts have on this topic. Not that I am a better academic in general, I'm not. I am inferior, probably on average. I'm probably at the 10th percentile compared to a real academic. But on this particular topic that I am fixated on, I have more experience than them most of the time. I mean, that's just a fact. And incidentally, a proclamation by one of these student body councils, these are going to be dumber than what any individual member of these councils would say, given that intelligent people are more likely to get answers correct if they work alone than if they do in groups. At least this is true for math, for higher level math, for calculus. That is, if you give someone a calculus question and you give this question to a person with an IQ of 120 or above, you're more likely to get a correct answer by asking one person than by having a group of 3 answer the question and using the group answer. So the individual work is better than group work at 120 and above. Below 100, group work is actually better than individual work, and I believe this is because at that level it's more a function of remembering rote rules than it is about actual creative thinking, whereas at the higher level you're dealing with more complex problems that require creative thinking, and for that, an individual working alone does better than a group. So when you have a council or these big groups deciding things and making proclamations, that's a pure authority play. It's not about science. It's designed to bamboozle smooth brains, which Pakman is, and to make a political point, and they appear to have succeeded in this case.
But some people were even saying that the NIH and the APA take this position on race because they are institutions controlled by liberals. I do want to just break this down again, because it really is what makes the entire race realist argument about genetic IQ completely implode. In biology, we do not have genetically discrete groups based on continent of origin or skin color or what we would call black, white, Asian, Indian, Hispanic. We have patterns of continuous variation from a continental level all the way down to the population level, rather than these abrupt, clear differences between continents.
Okay, this is a real dumb argument, and he just blows past it. He just leaves it in the dust. He's just making the continuum fallacy here. So the quick kill on this is that we can look at chimpanzees. Now, there are actually lots of ways of measuring genetic distance, but by certain measures, we can say that there's more variation within chimpanzees and humans than between chimpanzees and humans. So you can say, and be correct in saying, that humans and chimpanzees are distinct clines, not distinct species or subspecies. But the reason it doesn't matter is because not all genes are the same, and not all variation even results in any difference in protein synthesis. But more importantly, we have all sorts of genetic cluster analyses where you just give a computer program a bunch of data and tell it to either make a certain number of clusters, k-means, or tell it to come up with the ideal number of clusters in a structure analysis, and they fit the classical races to a T. Structure analyses tend to come up with anywhere from 7 to 10 races based on, tweaking the goes intos. And as it happens, self-identified race and best fit cluster correspond well over 90%, with around 300 genes being used. And when you use more genes, you get a higher correspondence than this. On top of this, humans meet traditional definitions of subspecies just fine. From Futoyama, 2005, defines subspecies as, quote, a recognizably distinct population or group of populations that occupies a different geographic area from other populations of the same species. Populations of a species that are distinguishable by one or more characteristics and are given a subspecific name. From Strickberger, 2000, he defines it as, quote, a taxonomic division of a species often distinguished by special phenotypic characteristics and by its origin or localization in a given geographic region, close quote. Okay, there you go. Moreover, we can compare the average FST distance between humans and other animals with generally recognized subspecies. Humans pass that test, and we can see that humans are clustered just as well as several other species with generally recognized subspecies. And there's also plenty of overall genetic variation. That is, the total genetic variation in Homo sapiens is enough for there to be subspecies, and it clusters well enough for there to be subspecies. Humans check all the boxes. They fit all the requirements for being a subspecies. The opposition to classifying humans as subspecies is political. Oh, and I almost forgot. Pakman notes that Polynesians are racially homogenous.
And one of the most interesting counterpoints to the racial IQ success theory is Polynesians. Native Polynesians are a racially or ethnically homogenous group.
But Pakman, how can that be when all the variation is clinal and continuous? What even is a Polynesian? Homogeneous? You're saying, but you keep saying that races aren't homogeneous, but I guess this is the one exception where it is homogeneous? Now, look, everyone knows what a Polynesian is, as do population geneticists, as do the people who even claim they deny race. It's funny. It's not just Pakman does this, but people who actually deny race and say that races don't exist, it's all clinal and whatever. When push comes to shove, they have an uncanny ability to suddenly recognize that things like Polynesians and Melanesians and Australian Aborigines and even genetic distinctions between Japanese and Chinese exist. They have no problem with suddenly recognizing them when it's convenient, but then they deny it when it's politically expedient to deny it.
These two people, clearly these are two people of African descent. There's something visually distinct about people of African descent. You'd be wrong. The man on the left is an Aboriginal Australian, and the boy on the right is a Jarawa, an indigenous people of the Andaman Islands in Southeast Asia. We learn nothing about their genetics by looking at them, and your average person from either of these two regions would have very little in common genetically with someone from Africa.
Wow, this is a pretty good point. I agree, Pakman. Race is not just skin deep. You know, this is really funny that Pakman does his little grandstanding here, thinks he's making a cute point with this. But I actually saw this and I knew immediately from looking at this that this was an Abo, and the one on the right, I didn't know it was an Andaman, but I knew it wasn't a Bantu or any African group. Of course, there's no way for the viewer to verify that I knew this beforehand, but honest Injuns, I knew that these were not Bantus, Nilots, Khoi, or Pygmy straight away. And these people, they are not visually indistinguishable. Yes, they all have black skin, but when Europeans made first contact with the Melanesians, on first contact, the Europeans who arrived immediately recognized them as being distinct from the Africans. Like, on day one, the European explorers did not conflate these people with Africans. I don't know what point Pakman is trying to make with this. Like, European, like, the people who studied race in the past, they never made this error. Oh, and just as an aside, how could you tell this is an Abo and not a Swede, Pakman? How can you tell this is an Andaman and not a Mesoamerican or not a Cherokee? I mean, more variation within them between, then how can you have these hard visual distinctions between them? Or for that, is there less variation within them between for certain superficial traits, but everything else, there's more variation within them between? Like, this is all just made up. This is all just ad hoc. These are all just sciencey sounding arguments to try to deny race, but again, when the rubber hits the road, it just goes right out the window, and suddenly you know what an Abo is.
This is an example we used in the other video, but I think it's a good one. Sickle cell anemia. There's a misconception that black people get this disease because there's something genetically that black people have in common. Here's a map of the distribution of sickle cell anemia, which is common in the Middle East and India as well, because it develops where malaria is common. It has nothing to do with being black or African and black people sharing DNA.
This is an example of Pakman not understanding the debate at all. Sickle cell anemia is a prime example of a racialized trait. He showed it right here. Okay, it's in parts of India too, so what? It's not in Scandinavia. It's not in North America. It's not in Japan. Pakman, this is precisely what we're talking about. And when you say something is not discrete, this is what you mean by not discrete? It looks pretty discrete to me. This is supposed to be a refutation of something, I'm not sure what, but it's actually a prime example of a trait, not one we particularly care about, but it's a prime example of a trait unevenly distributed between the races.
And we know that this isn't the case when we're talking about races. Research has shown us that the IQ differences we see between races is no greater than the IQ differences we observe between children raised in different environments.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what he's doing here. If he's just looking at correlational studies, well then it's just a chicken and egg question. Sure, you can correlate lower incomes with lower IQs. It's so cringy to have to say this, but okay, correlation is not causation, Pakman. I hate saying that because it's so obvious and it's such a basic thing, but I feel like it got just a little bit dumber by saying that. I feel like it just dunked into like the dumb tank to have to say that. Correlation is not causation. God. If he's talking about studies of twins reared apart, no, you're wrong. If he's talking about IQ correlations and familiarity, no, he's wrong. Your biological parent has far more influence on your IQ than your adoptive parent does. And what does he mean by environment plays a massive factor? What's that supposed to mean? 10%, 90%? Now, there's a few ways we can do this. We can continue kind of this confrontational mode and endless resistance mode that Pakman is in, or just shift into let me just explain the world to you mode. And right now, I'm moving out of arguing with idiots mode into just explaining the world mode. So here I go. The general heritability of IQ for adults in the Western world is generally recognized to be around 80%, and the heritability is higher on G-loaded tests. So the heritability of the general intelligence factor is going to be around 90%. There are multiple lines of evidence for this. You have twin studies, you have subtest heritability analysis, you have regression toward the mean, and you have longitudinal analysis. There's also some molecular genetic stuff coming online, but that's not going to be ready, at least not publicly, until around September. There's stuff coming down the pike on that on the molecular genetics front. What we care about is the G factor, not IQ per se, which is why we can use things like the SAT as a proxy for G. Now, let's talk about African Americans. The IQs of African Americans are around 85. They still are. Like the black-white IQ gap is about 1 white standard deviation. Now, the general heritability of IQ in adults in the West is around 0.8. Just IQ for now, not talking about G. The general heritability for IQ in adults aged 24 and older is around 0.8. The lower numbers are from poor countries, not OECD, not NATO countries, which have more environmental variance, and they're in little children where genes aren't fully expressed. Heritability of IQ and all mental traits increases with age for the same reason your hair gets darker with age. Gene amplification with age. Okay, this is true. We're not having a debate about this. This is true. Just okay. Given a general heritability of 0.8, blacks could have a worse environment than whites. That's true. So even if the general heritability for the whole population, which again, the general heritability for the whole population, this is where the plants in different soils analogy breaks down, because the 0.8 heritability, it's for the whole population, including whites, including blacks, including Hispanics, all, smushed together. Okay, so that's where sort of the plants in different soils analogy sort of breaks down, because they're not in separate plots of soil. It's more like they're in the same plots of soil, but in like different plots on it. And the heritability of traits within this overall patch is 0.8, which they're sort of scattered around in blacks generally in one area, whites generally in another area. So given this, how much worse would the environments of African Americans have to be in order for the black-white IQ gap to be explainable by a confluence of environmental factors? There's actually a simple mathematical answer for this, and the answer is about 2.236 standard deviations, which would mean that the average black environment is at the 1.267th percentile of white environments. That is, the typical black person would have to have an environment worse than 98.73% of all white people. Now, we can look at income as a rather crude indicator of environment. The median income of blacks in the US in 2017 was $40,258. The median income of whites in the US in 2017 was $68,145. Blacks are roughly around the 31st percentile of white income. So if we take income as a rough proxy for environment, blacks would be on average at the 31st percentile of white environments. And as it happens, blacks being at the 31st percentile of white environments, having a standard deviation IQ gap which puts them at the 15.9th percentile of white IQ, and a general heritability of IQ overall of 80%, this number just so happens to imply that the black-white IQ gap is 80% heritable, in line with the general heritability of IQ. This is what you would expect if the structure of environmental effects in the black population were identical to the structure of environmental effects of the white population, which is what I contend. Not that blacks don't have worse environments overall, they do, but that it tracks income, i.e. at any given income level, blacks and whites have the same environments, i.e. there are no environmental disadvantages particular to blacks that they face over and above whatever disadvantages are associated with just having a lower income. And a recommended viewing on this topic is a video I did called Why 80%, where I show this by looking at longitudinal data, which shows that the black-white IQ gap increases with age as the general heritability of IQ increases with age, in such a way as to imply that the adult gap is about 80% heritable. And I show, based on subtest analysis, that the more heritable subtests of IQ tests have higher racial gaps in such a way as to imply an 80% heritability. That the more heritable subtests have higher racial gaps, the subtests that are more a function of environment have smaller racial gaps, and the degree to which this is true implies a heritability of the overall racial IQ gaps of 80%. So we have multiple lines of evidence all pointing to the same conclusion of an 80% heritability of the black-white IQ gap and other racial gaps as well. There's less evidence on that, but those also point to 80%. Basically, between group gaps track within the whole entire population heritability. And keep in mind that the real income of blacks in the US is higher than several European countries. And to the extent that environment roughly tracks income, black people probably don't suffer from bad environments. Their incomes are about the same as that of French people. Another thing to keep in mind is that environment, quote unquote, is not all it's cracked up to be. We can actually talk about the heritability of environment, and there's studies that look at the heritability of environment, because environment is largely a choice. For example, nutrition. What is the heritability of eating nutritious foods? What is the heritability of reading? What is the heritability of doing things like playing a musical instrument that raises your IQ a little bit? In addition, even the environment that's given to you by your parents and your peers, well, those tend to be people who are genetically similar to you. So environment is strongly genetically correlated, if not outright a creation by you yourself. So even the part of general heritability and the racial IQ gaps that are attributable to environment, don't get too excited about that. Environment doesn't mean what you think it means. Environment is not totally external to the person. So that's just explaining how this actually is and how this actually works. This part of the video, I'm not in debate mode. I'm not going to entertain objections to this because I'm just explaining things, just a very basic explanation of how this sort of works. Don't post dumb objections to this part of the video. This is true. Now I'm going to go back to trying to argue with a kindergartner.
To confirm that that's the case, you would need 1, specific identifiable genes that consistently cause people to have higher IQs.
Now, first off, you don't have to find the genes. This is why we have twins reared apart and reared together studies. Twins reared apart are just what they sound like, and twins reared together are where you compare the similarities in traits between identical twins and non-identical twins. Basically, you're looking at how much more similar identical twins are than non-identical twins on any given trait you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at IQ scores, and then you multiply that increase in similarity by 2, and that's the heritability estimate. Roughly. There's some things where it's not exactly that, but that's basically what's going on. So it's quite simple. and it's validated in terms of being able to predict the traits of an offspring from two parents whose traits are known, i.e. the results from twins reared together study. These results are predictive, not just retrodictive. But this is also stupid because Pakman doesn't think you have to find the genes when coming up with general heritability estimates. But as soon as we're looking at between group heritability estimates, then suddenly you have to know what every gene does. And this is such a stupid and obvious oversight. Like when Pakman straight up says that we know about the general heritability, well, that's done without reference to specific genes. But then he just is this bizarre random 180 where he says, oh, but when talking about group differences, the thing he cares about with races, now you have to find every specific gene and you have to dot every I and cross every T. Like, how do you do that? And he says it literally in the same slide. We can find the heritability without reference to genes, but group differences, for those you must find the genes. I mean, it's surreal how Pakman can make these contradictory statements in the same sentence and still believe them. Now, what's actually happening here is Pakman is just sort of being bamboozled by charlatans. Because it's like mainstream, above board, politically correct to say, at least for now, it's still politically correct to say, that the general heritability of IQ is rather high. Some will say 0.5, some will say 0.8, but it's recognized that that's an okay thing for you to say. That is a politically allowable thing for you to say. Group differences in IQ is less politically allowable. It's not totally verboten, and a lot of that just has to do with the profound strength of the research. I mean, there's a lot of people who want it to be verboten, but the research is just so overwhelmingly one-sided that they can't really get away with it. So it's sort of a kind of edge case as to whether or not it's forbidden for you to say that evolution didn't stop at the neck and that, humans, like every other species, is going to differentiate based on the region they evolved in. So what's actually happening is Pakman is literally just going along with like PC allowable thought. That's the only guide rail he has, right? So this double standard in saying you have to find the genes when talking about group differences in heritability, but you don't have to find the genes when talking about general heritability, that is nothing more than a function of his, skating along the politically correct guide rails. Because genetic differences between groups, that is something that is politically sketchy and it's quote unquote on the right, according to him. And so for that, he then just throws out a whole bunch of criticisms. Whatever criticism he can find, whatever criticism is fed to him, he just parrots. But when he's looking at general heritability, now he's in sort of politically safe territory, and then he just says what is, mainstream science on that. Okay, that's all this is. It's just a politically expediential, circumstantial thing that he's doing. It has nothing to do with any consistency or any reasoning or logic. And it's so transparent and it's so silly because when most people do this, it's spaced apart. Like when Nisbet does this, it'll be spaced apart by like 200 pages in a book. Pakman, because he's dumb and he doesn't understand that he's lying, like Nisbet knows that he's lying, and so he'll do this like 200 pages apart. But since Pakman is so dumb and doesn't know that he's lying, he actually believes this crap. He's actually does it right next to each other to where it's really obvious, and that's why you get silly stuff like, we understand the general heritability is 0.5 or something, but for group differences, to find the heritability on that, you must find the specific genes, right? That is such a bizarre, in-your-face, retarded statement that when the experts, when the PhDs do that, they conceal it. They hide it between hundreds of pages between each other in a book. Or they obscure it in jargon in a paper that nobody reads in their own sort of hugbox journals, right? But Pakman, he's so dumb, he actually drunk the Kool-Aid. He actually believes this, whereas Nisbet does not actually believe this. Nisbet is deliberately lying. Pakman actually believes this, and so that's why he makes the lie so obvious. And it's just kind of funny to see.
If you're dealing with something biological, like genetic IQ, you have to be weighing it against something that is also biological. It would be totally meaningless, for example, for us to do research on the correlation between having red hair and being a libertarian. One is a biological trait, one is a socially constructed trait.
Okay, why is he doing this? Why is he saying just these randomly wrong things? Now, there are studies on the heritability of all sorts of psychological traits, from social conformity, individualism, religiosity, political views, vegetarianism. Basically, any mental trait is heritable, meaning some variation in that mental trait is going to be to some extent explainable by genes. Whether or not you want to call it a social construct is irrelevant. Is vegetarianism a social construct? Who cares? We can define vegetarianism and we can look at twin studies and figure out the heritability of vegetarianism. We can define individualism by some parameter. Maybe you want to say the parameter is a bit subjective, fine. Or you want to say libertarianism is a sort of subjective parameter, fine. But by that subjective parameter, we can figure out the heritability. And the problem is not with the heritability estimate. The problem, if there is one, is with the subjective parameter, what it is you're measuring. Like the measurement device itself works fine. The measurement device itself works fantastically well. Okay? The only issue with something like libertarianism or individualism would be that that thing is sort of difficult to define. Maybe religiosity, how you define how religious someone is, may be a little bit of a fiddle factor there. Now, for political views, it's just like this. It's just the heritability of political views works just like the heritability of social conformity, individualism, religiosity. And in fact, for the heritability of political views, it's a little bit better because we have more objective criteria for what constitutes an index of political views. And for studies on that, it runs around 0.4 heritability in the West. However, there are some issues like immigration that have higher heritabilities than that. On top of that, different regions have differences not only in individualism and social sensitivity, but there are particular genes that explain anywhere from 20 to 40% of the variance in individualism and social sensitivity. And these are just the effects of single genes that have been found, which is to say, no, political views are in fact highly heritable. They vary by population, genetically, in precisely the way we would expect. So redheads, I mean, you could pretend to be stupid. Like redheads are probably more likely to be libertarian for genetic reasons. Now look, this is where you can pretend to be stupid about this. I haven't seen a study particular to redheads, to gingers, but Northern and Western Europeans are more individualistic. And we know of some genetic correlates for that. And we also know that the further toward the center of Eurasia you get, the greater the genetic correlates with collective attitudes tend to be. We also know that the general heritability of political views in the West, at least, is around 0.4. So it's probably similar to that elsewhere in the world. Maybe it's a little bit lower in other parts of the world where there's more environmental variation. Or maybe less. Maybe there's more political conformity in Asia than in Europe. I don't know. But there's no reason to just assume, as Pakman does, that there's no genetic correlation there, or that there's no genetic difference there. It's just weird. And look, the brain is a physical organ. It's influenced by genes. Everything the brain does is going to be genetically influenced. Period. That's the simplest way to explain it. What defines the structure of your brain, the basic fundamental structure of your brain, are your genes. Now, nutrition, infant environment, those stuff matter too, not as much as you might think. And people tend to overstate environmental explanations simply by doing the sort of correlation equals causation stuff, right? They'll point to certain things that correlate with having low IQs and assume it's causal. That's where you get these stratospheric environmental estimates, because what people are doing is they're just running a whole bunch of correlations. They're saying, hey, if you control for, playing the lottery, explains 60% of differences in IQ because people with lower IQs play the lottery. So playing the lottery lowers your IQ, right? It's not that transparently stupid, but it's kind of like that. It's kind of like, for example, reading to your children. Like they look at the correlation because smarter people tend to read to their children. And people think, oh, because smarter people read to their children, that's causing their children to have higher IQs. It doesn't. It has basically no effect. Right. But anyway, so that's this weird, unnecessary thing Pakman is saying, well, political views have no genetic component to them. Well, individualism and collectivism do, and we actually know of specific genes, and we have heritability estimates for political views that work the same way as the heritability estimates for IQ that Pakman accepts. It's just dumb. Anyway, links in the description for this. I have an article I wrote explaining this, as well as available as some of the studies I cited. Also, within the article itself, there's inline citations to all the studies that I use. Read the article. I write good articles. I write the best articles. But no, if you read my articles, you're gonna find I stick very closely to the research. I don't have flights of fancy, having ridiculous extrapolations beyond what the data itself is saying. So my articles are good. They're not dangerous. They're not racist. Okay, they're very straightforward and they're very well sourced. So go to the website and read the article.
There is no gene or set of genes that all people from one race have. There's so much genetic diversity within what we refer to as races that any conversation about weighing a biological variable like genetic IQ against race is moot from the beginning.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to this in two ways, and both responses to this are sufficient to rebut. First, he says that you have to have discrete races in order to have IQ differences between them. Well, first off, we do have discrete races. As stated previously, humans check all the boxes for subspecies. They have enough general heterozygosity. It clusters well enough. It's distinguishable on a practical level, right? So we have it there. That's done. That's all you need. You don't have to have these ridiculous, goofy standards. FST of 0.25, that's just made up. Okay, there's plenty of animals that don't have these numbers that we recognize subspecies. Humans have subspecies, done. Okay, but I'm not satisfied with just saying that because this is a bullshit standard. Look, you can have two groups of people and they can be divided on the basis of religion, on political party, on what kind of shoes they wear, which way they part their hair, whether they're an innie or outie belly button. And so there you have it. You have two groups. And those groups divided by anything, any criteria you want to divide them on, these groups can differ in the frequency of any number of genes, including genes that influence any manner of cognitive traits. For example, it could be the case that a single gene, that an allele frequency difference at a single gene location is responsible for all differences in intelligence. That is theoretically possible. That's not what's actually the case, but that's theoretically possible to be the case. And you could have two groups that are almost identical except one has dimples and the other doesn't have dimples on their cheeks. And the dimpled people have one higher IQ point because of a slight genetic variation at this location. And that can be true. And this can be true whether or not the dimpled are classified as a separate race, or whether the innie or outie belly button people are classified as a separate race. In other words, to put it, here's a way to phrase it that's kind of tongue-in-cheek. You don't need to have biological races in order to have biological race differences. Like, you can have systematic differences in the genome between any two groups, whether you want to call them separate races or not. That's like, and so that's kind of funny. So when we talk about race and intelligence, the actual, true, quote unquote, to the extent anything in taxonomy is true, whether or not you have quote unquote true races is irrelevant. Because if you have genetic differences between two groups, inferred either through molecular genetic data or through things like twin studies or subtest and factor analysis, which I'm not going to get into here. I'm sorry. If you can infer genetic differences, then those genetic differences are there, whether the two groups you're comparing meet some, arbitrary standard for race or not, right? So the existence of true biological race is kind of a sideshow, right? And for all the talk about it, and I do talk about it, and make a point to meet them on their terms and say, no, humans meet all the standards. Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. But also, your standards are bogus anyway. These standards don't even need to be met in order to talk about what we're talking about, which are sociologically relevant implications of genetic differences between groups, okay? Let's say blacks and whites in the US actually didn't look different and that was actually just sort of a conditioning. They don't actually look different. They actually look identical or whatever. Let's just say that were the case. And that there actually were like almost no genetic variations between them, except for a few differences in parts of the genome that code for intelligence, that code for things that are relevant to, cognitive functions. There you go, right? You have your groups, you have the blacks and the whites, and you draw circles around them. Whether they are truly separate races or not is irrelevant to the question of, do they have differences in, I guess we could say, genetic propensity to, Pakman says IQ, but really genetic propensity to the G factor. So the standard is dumb, is what I'm saying. You don't need to have biological races in order to have biological differences between the groups that we are calling races. That said, there really are races in the sense that they are subspecies, and humans check all the boxes. Done.
We also know that IQs in the United States and worldwide have risen more quickly in the past 100 years than could ever be accounted for by genetics. IQ heritability can even vary widely based on when and where you study it, under what circumstances, making it much more difficult to nail down. Is it a 0.2 correlation? Is it 0.5? Is it something else? But there's not much disagreement that IQ can be genetically inherited to some extent. It's more than 0, but it's definitely not 1.
Okay, so Pakman just mangles heritability so badly that the quickest way to respond would be to just say Pakman is wrong about what heritability means, and let me just tell you what heritability actually means. Heritability is about variance. Take a cow. What percentage of the cow is genetic? What percent of the cow is a product of his environment? It's a meaningless question. All organisms are genes expressed in an environment. It's not a certain percentage, one or the other. So when Pakman says IQ is somewhat genetically inherited or whatever, that is a literally nonsense statement. It doesn't mean anything. It can't mean anything. What we can talk about is variance. We can, in principle, look at 2 cows, take a parameter, say the weight of the cow, and come up with an estimate for how much of the variation in weight is a result of variation in genes. That is heritability. It is the variation in a given trait, so height, weight, IQ score, religiosity, that is explainable by variation in genes. What proportion of the differences in people in a trait are a result of genetic differences? That's heritability. Now, something like height and weight are straightforward to measure. Something like religiosity is more difficult to measure because you have to ask questions or maybe look at some behavior that you think are indicative of religiosity and then weigh these in some sort of an index. This is called operationalization. Like if someone wanted to measure the heritability of being funny, you would come up with some test of how funny someone was, maybe give them a situation, ask them to make jokes about it, and see how the audience responds. And the audience responses would be a measure of the funniness of the person, and you'd want to use multiple crowds or something like that. Now with IQ, it's straightforward. That's just a score on an IQ test. Done. As far as IQ is concerned. The heritability of IQ is as easy to measure as the heritability of weight. A little bit, not quite as easy because they have to sit down and do the tests, but it's just as objective as the heritability of weight. And IQ fluctuates about as much as weight does on average, though obviously weight has much more potential fluctuation. You can't double your IQ as an adult, but you can double your weight. The range of fluctuation for weight is higher than IQ, even though the practical day-to-day fluctuation of IQ is, if anything, greater than practical fluctuation of weight. Whether or not you got enough sleep can affect your IQ by, 3 or 4 points, whereas it's unlikely for your weight to shift 3 or 4 pounds in the same period of time. But the point is, both are highly heritable, and they both have purely objective measures. But G is what we care about, not IQ. And like the test for religiosity, you have a test and a score on that test, and that's objective. Just like the IQ test is objective. But what you really care about is not the score on the religiosity test, but the underlying religiosity that score represents. With IQ tests, we don't care about the objective score on the IQ test, except insofar that it's a good measure of an underlying general intelligence. Okay, back to dummy Pakman. Pakman brings up the Tuddenham effect, which he erroneously calls the Flynn effect, which is that raw scores on IQ tests in the past rose as environment improved over a period of time. They're not rising now. They're going down now because environmental improvements have been exhausted as far as we know, and the fact that fertility is inversely correlated with intelligence is starting to suppress the raw IQ scores. Now, I say raw IQ scores, that's not the same as the standard score that you see. The median for whites in an IQ test will always be 100. IQ tests are normed in such a way that the white average, median, and mode, the peak of the bell curve, is set to 100 by construction. And that's fine, so long as you know what you're doing. Because if IQ tests were invented today, obviously they would never do something as racialized as this. So it's kind of a throwback to to a less ideological time when people could think more freely and do stuff that was just convenient, like having, racially separated bell curves. So the median score for whites may be getting 80% of the questions right in 1990, but in 2020, the median score drops to getting 75% of the questions right. In both years, even though the median is a different raw score, that raw score is set to 100, and so it's relative. This is also why the general rise in IQ scores that occurred in the past didn't close any racial gaps, because an IQ score is actually a rank order score. And so environmental improvements helped the lower classes more than it helped the upper classes, because everyone got some environmental improvements. And the raw score gap closed between the upper and lower classes, but nobody leapfrogged anyone else between any two positions. And this is why blacks never narrowed the gap in standard score, even though they narrowed the gap in raw score, because whites benefited from environmental improvements over time as well. Even if it wasn't as much as blacks overall, the lower class whites benefited from environmental improvements just as much as lower class blacks did, for example. And so everyone is moving up. And so while there's a compression between the classes in raw score, there's no overlap, because everyone is moving up a little bit. It's just the upper classes are moving up a little bit more, but it's not enough to overtake anyone ahead of them, right? It's kind of like, it's kind of like the extension and compression of an accordion. When you compress an accordion, yeah, the little ridges get closer together, or you stretch it out, they get further apart, but there's no overlap. The rank order remains the same no matter how much you stretch or compress. And that's what's kind of happening with the Tuddenham effect, or Flynn effect. And if you don't trust me, because I'm the bad man, I'm the bad guy or whatever. Okay, well, James Flynn himself actually said basically this. And he also said that the causes of the Flynn effect, I guess we're calling it the Flynn effect now, that the causes of it, he says the causes of the Flynn effect are totally exclusive to the causes of the racial gaps. And the reason for this has to go back to what I talked about earlier, the G factor. Basically, racial gaps are total G. They're like pure G, the racial gaps. Whereas the gains from the Flynn effect are completely hollow for G. And this is what Flynn acknowledges, and he says that the Flynn effect does not explain racial gaps. So don't take it from me, because I'm the bad guy who hates brown people or whatever, to go ahead and take it from the namesake of the argument that you're using, who says that it doesn't explain racial differences. Take it from him. And based on how heritability works, it makes precisely zero sense to say things like IQ is genetically inherited anymore than it makes sense to say height is genetically inherited. This is nonsense speak done by non-biologists and hereditary psychologists. Or someone who isn't an autodidact and who just learned all the stuff on his own. But that's all just why Pakman's mangling of heritability in the Tuddenham or Flynn effect reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of so much of the basic terms he's speaking of.
So yeah, the people who peddle the race realist stuff about IQ are usually the same people who have this mantra about how important IQ is and how fatalistic and linked to success it is, which makes sense because IQ tests being relevant or useful to begin with is a necessary premise for everything else that follows in these hypotheses. They will say IQ tests are an authoritative measure of intelligence, and it's the most accurate measure of intelligence and of human potential. And that's how the race realists ensure that the next claim really comes with a sting, the claim that black people or Hispanic people or whoever are on average destined to have lower IQs. So basically those groups are predetermined to live measurably lower quality lives.
Now, this is such a crazy and hyper-ideological way of describing the situation. Whites in the US are the only people who can be legally discriminated against, and who are discriminated against in college admissions and in getting a job. We know this because white people at the same jobs at the same companies have higher objective and subjective performance ratings. In fact, whites do better on the objective performance ratings than the subjective one, nullifying any notions that they're being favored in the performance ratings. What this means is that employers are hiring less capable blacks at any given position than whites, And this is going to be true with Hispanics as well, given that all this stems from a racism against the European diaspora. At the UC system in California, for example, they have something called the Holistic Index, where they take circumstantial factors into letting someone in on top of their resume otherwise. And this is supposed to be divorced from race. However, a Freedom of Information Act revealed that this wasn't enough, because the UC system, through this index, they ended up accepting just a bunch of whites and Asians who theoretically had poor circumstances according to the Holistic Index. They were accepting basically no blacks got in, even with the Holistic Index scores. The UC system thus had to engage in pure racial discrimination over and above any circumstantial disadvantage. Keep in mind, this did not happen in the Jim Crow South. Blacks who attended universities in the Jim Crow South had lower performances than the whites who did, both in terms of their entrance credentials and in terms of their performance while at the universities, which means less capable blacks were being accepted to Southern universities than the whites were, even in the Jim Crow South. Affirmative action favoring blacks in the Jim Crow South. And that's just one thing. That's just one little red sliver of a pill. And Pakman here, he's talking about wanting worse lives or whatever, and I don't know who the fuck he's talking about. He doesn't cite anyone, just this vague, they want brown people to suffer. This is a cartoon. Aren't you guys supposed to be nuanced thinkers? Aren't you guys supposed to be sophisticated and able to understand complex arguments? And then you say this garbage that's straight out of a movie villain. Speaking for myself, I want social justice. I want the privileged races to have their privilege taken away, and I want their racist revenge narratives, their racial nationalism to be refuted, and for the people who push these narratives to be destroyed. I want it to be recognized as a form of bigotry, as a form of racism, and as a form of privilege that needs to be deconstructed and removed. In the backwards world we're in today, what Pakman says, and this thing that I'm up against, it's called the left. But Pakman is really an agent of what should be called the far right. They are humorless, socially authoritarian busybodies who want to prohibit you from saying anything bad or even joke about the privileged groups. They then scapegoat the European diaspora as being responsible for all the world's problems, when it is undeniable that the European diaspora ended feudalism worldwide, ended slavery worldwide, created the modern economy as we know it. And Pakman then makes a really angry face when his hate fuel is questioned. He pushes the talking points of the establishment, from Amazon to Google to Burger King to McDonald's, Facebook. Pick a company, and it's either apolitical or pushes the hate narratives that Pakman pushes. And of course, institutional media is all on his side, and the government itself racially discriminates against Europeans and has quotas set for the privileged groups. Pakman, you are a racist, a nationalist, and a theocrat by proxy in your support for Islam. You support the capitalists, you support the party bosses, even the Pope agrees with you. All of the retrograde forces in the world, all of the bad guys are on your side. Think about it, Pakman. When all of the traditionally bad guys and bad organizations in history are on your side, maybe you want to think for 2 seconds. Maybe you want to reconsider what you're saying for just 2 seconds when all of the bad actors are on your side. And of course, they have convinced you that what they are is precisely the opposite of what they are. Hitler hated IQ tests because they didn't conform to his ideology, and so did Stalin. The Nazis created a bogus IQ test based on a series of literature questions, nothing but information, and a subjective assessment of intelligence by the proctor. The proctor would interview you, and then he would subjectively rate how smart he thought you were. The real IQ tests Hitler hated, and he called them Jewish because Jews did so well on them, right? A group that he scapegoated for all the world's problems, right? Sound familiar, Pakman? And Stalin hated IQ tests because he called them bourgeois, right? Because the bourgeois did well on them. And who did the Soviet Union scapegoat for all the world's problems? The bourgeois. Sound familiar? What do you call them, Pakman? We know what Hitler called them. We know what Stalin called them. What do you call them? What is your reason for dismissing them? What are your ideological reasons for dismissing them? And how do you feel about the results? Results which stand against your rape and revenge narratives and which stand against your hatred of the European diaspora.
And that's just that. It might be sad, we might not like it, but it's the truth.